I was 23 years old when I made the call that killed maybe 40 men in less than 3 minutes. And I can still hear the way my hands shook when I pressed the radio handset against my frozen ear that morning outside Bastogne. My name was Staff Sergeant William Mercer, forward observer with the 406th 3rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion attached to the 101st Airborne. And on December 23, 1944, I was lying in a snow-filled foxhole watching German armor roll toward our lines through my M3 binoculars, while trying to remember if I'd calculated the grid coordinates correctly. The temperature was somewhere around -15 degrees Fahrenheit. My breath came out in clouds so thick I could barely see through them, and I knew that if I gave the Fire Direction Center the wrong numbers, I'd be dropping 105mm high explosive shells on American positions instead of Panzers. We'd been surrounded in Bastogne for 3 days by then, cut off from the rest of Patton's Third Army, when the Germans launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, and every morning started with the same sick feeling in my gut when I climbed out of whatever hole I'd been sleeping in to scan the tree line for enemy movement. I'd trained for this job at Fort Sill in Oklahoma for 6 months, learning how to read terrain and calculate firing solutions and call adjustments over crackling radio nets, but nothing they taught us in the classroom prepared me for what it felt like to be the eyes for 12 howitzers when you're freezing your ass off in Belgium. And you know that making one mistake means friendly casualties. My fire direction officer, Lieutenant Morrison from Connecticut, told me on my second day in combat that being an FO was the loneliest job in the army because you lived out front with the infantry, but you weren't really one of them, and the artillery guys back at the guns trusted you to keep them shooting at the right targets, even though they couldn't see what you were seeing. The morning it happened started like most mornings during the siege, with me crawling out of my foxhole around 0530 while it was still dark and checking my radio equipment to make sure the batteries hadn't frozen overnight. I shared that particular hole with a kid from the 101st named Tommy Brennan, who couldn't have been more than 19 years old, and he was supposed to be my security while I focused on observation and fire missions, but mostly he just sat there shivering and asking me every 20 minutes if I thought Patton was really coming to break through the German lines like everyone kept saying. I never knew what to tell him, because the truth was that none of us knew if relief was coming at all, and every day we stayed trapped in that frozen town meant our ammunition got lower and our food supplies got thinner, and more guys ended up in the aid stations with frostbite or trench foot or worse. I'd been with the 463rd since Normandy, jumped into France on D-Day with a radio strapped to my back and a prayer that my chute would open, and I thought I understood what combat looked like after we fought our way through the hedgerows and helped liberate Paris in August. But Bastogne was different, colder and more desperate, with Germans attacking from every direction and our perimeter shrinking every day as they pushed closer to the town center, where the wounded were stacked in every available building. My battalion commander, Colonel Cooper, was one of those guys who never seemed to sleep and always had mud on his boots, no matter what time of day you saw him, and he made it clear to all the forward observers that we were the key to holding the line, because our artillery was the only thing keeping the Germans from overrunning our positions entirely. The observation post I was assigned to that week was in the ruins of a farmhouse about 800 meters northeast of the main defensive line, close enough that I could see our guys in their foxholes if I looked back over my shoulder, but far enough forward that I had a clear view of the approach routes the Germans would have to use if they wanted to attack from that sector. Lieutenant Morrison had picked the location himself 2 days earlier, walking the ground with me while mortar rounds landed randomly around the area, and he'd pointed out the key terrain features I needed to memorize so I could call accurate fire even if visibility went to shit. There was a small woods about 1,200 meters out that the Germans liked to use for staging, a shallow depression in the ground at 1,100 meters where vehicles could hide from aerial observation, and a ridgeline at 1,500 meters that gave them a covered route of advance until they got close enough for a final push. I'd called fire missions before, plenty of them, adjusting artillery onto German infantry positions and machine gun nests, and even a few half-tracks that got too aggressive during probing attacks. The procedure was always the same, calm and methodical, like they taught us at Fort Sill, starting with the call sign and grid coordinates, and then walking the rounds onto target with adjustments in meters and direction until you got the burst pattern where you wanted it. But I'd never called fire on armor before, never had to deal with the pressure of knowing that if you didn't kill the tanks on the first salvo, They'd roll right through your lines and turn everything behind them into a killing zone. Morrison had briefed me specifically on the anti-armor procedure, telling me that we'd use a mix of high explosive and white phosphorus to break up the formations and create smoke that would blind the German gunners, and he'd made me practice the call sequence until I could do it in my sleep. The night before the attack I couldn't sleep at all, just lay there in my foxhole listening to the sounds of the German artillery pounding our positions somewhere to the south and wondering if tomorrow would be the day they finally broke through. Brennan was snoring next to me despite the cold, wrapped in every blanket and poncho he could scrounge, and I envied him that ability to just shut down and rest, even when we were surrounded and outnumbered and running out of everything except determination. I checked my map for probably the 50th time, tracing the grid lines with my frozen finger and making sure I had the key coordinates memorized in case I lost the map or the visibility got so bad I couldn't read it. The radio was tucked under my field jacket to keep the batteries warm, and I tested it once every hour, just to make sure I still had comms with the FDC back at the gun line. When dawn came on the 23rd, it came with fog, thick and grey and cold enough to freeze the moisture right out of your lungs when you breathed. I could barely see 50 meters in front of my position, which meant the Germans could be moving armor up into attack positions, and I wouldn't know it until they were practically on top of us. Morrison came up to my position around 0600, crawling the last 100 meters on his belly because German snipers had been active in the area, and he told me that intelligence was reporting heavy vehicle movement in our sector during the night. "They're coming today, Mercer," he said, his voice barely above a whisper even though we were alone. "Maybe not this morning with this fog, but once it burns off, they're going to hit us hard. You need to be ready to call fire the second you see anything that looks like armor. No hesitation, no second-guessing yourself. We don't have enough anti-tank guns left to stop a coordinated push, so it's going to be on you and the other FOs to break them up with artillery before they can mass for a breakthrough." He left me his personal binoculars, a beautiful Zeiss pair he'd taken off a German officer in Normandy, and told me to use them because they were better than the standard-issue M3s in low-light conditions. Then he was gone, crawling back toward the main line while I settled in behind my spotting position and waited for the fog to lift. Brennan was awake by then, chewing on a piece of hardtack that was probably older than he was, and he asked me if I was scared. I told him I was terrified, which was the truth, but I also told him that being scared didn't matter as long as you did your job anyway. He nodded like he understood, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't really believe me, and I didn't blame him because I barely believed it myself. The fog started to thin out around 0830, lifting in patches that gave me glimpses of the terrain before closing in again like a curtain. I could hear engines somewhere out in the distance, a low rumble that could have been trucks or tanks, or just my imagination playing tricks on me after 3 days of constant stress and no real sleep. I got on the radio and reported the sound to the FDC, and they acknowledged and told me to keep them informed of any developments. My call sign was Anvil 6, and theirs was Hammer Base, and just hearing those familiar words over the crackling handset made me feel a little less alone out there in the cold. The artillery battalion had 12 M101A1 howitzers set up in a gun park about 3 kilometers behind the main line, each one capable of throwing a 105mm shell out to 11,000 meters with reasonable accuracy, and there was another battery of 155s even further back that could reach out to 14,000 if we really needed the range. Around 0900, the fog lifted enough that I could see clearly out to about 1,500 meters, and that's when I spotted them. At first it was just movement in the tree line near that staging area Morrison had pointed out, dark shapes that resolved themselves into vehicles as I focused the Zeiss binoculars and tried to count them through my pounding heartbeat. 4 Panzer IVs in the lead, their long 75mm guns pointed directly toward our lines, with what looked like at least 2 more tanks or assault guns behind them, and maybe a dozen half-tracks carrying infantry. They were moving slowly, deliberately, and I could see German soldiers walking alongside the vehicles in that cautious way that told me they knew we were out here somewhere and they were expecting contact. I grabbed the radio handset so hard my knuckles went white, and I forced myself to take a breath before I started talking because the last thing I needed was to sound panicked when I made the call. Hammer Base, this is Anvil 6, fire mission, over. The response came back immediately, the voice of Sergeant Rodriguez, who ran the FDC and who I'd known since basic training. Anvil 6, this is Hammer Base. Send it. Over. I looked down at my map, double-checked the grid coordinates against the terrain features I could see, and started talking in that flat, mechanical tone they'd drilled into us during training. Grid 327854, enemy armor, 6 vehicles, vicinity of Rally Point November, moving south toward our lines, request fire for effect with high explosive and white phosphorus mix, priority target, over. There was a pause, maybe 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, and then Rodriguez came back on. Anvil 6, confirm enemy armor, confirm 6 vehicles, confirm priority target, over. I could hear the tension in his voice because calling fire on armor meant we were about to use up a significant chunk of our limited ammunition supply, and Morrison would have to approve it before they fired. Hammer Base confirmed. Panzer Fees with infantry support. Range approximately 1,200 meters from friendly lines and closing. They're forming up for an assault. We need fire now. Over. Another pause, and then a different voice came on. Morrison's voice, and I knew he'd been listening the whole time. Anvil 6, this is Hammer 6. We're authorizing your fire mission, giving you all 12 tubes. Time of flight approximately 40 seconds. Mark your position with smoke and get your head down when you hear shot over. Over. I pulled a smoke grenade from my gear, popped it, and tossed it behind my foxhole so the gun crews would know exactly where I was and could calculate the safe distance from my position. The yellow smoke billowed up into the cold air, clearly visible even in the thinning fog, and I pressed myself into the bottom of my hole next to Brennan, who looked at me with wide eyes and asked what was happening. 12 guns inbound, I told him. When they fire, it's going to sound like the end of the world, and if I did the math right, those Panzers are about to have a very bad morning. He nodded and curled up into a ball, hands over his ears, waiting for the storm I'd just called down on the Germans. The radio crackled again. Anvil 6, shot over. That meant the guns had fired, and I had maybe 35 seconds before 105mm shells started landing on the coordinates I'd given them. I brought the binoculars back up and watched the German formation, which had stopped moving and seemed to be regrouping before making their final approach to our lines. The tank commanders were visible in their cupolas, scanning the area with their own binoculars, and I wondered if they had any idea what was about to happen to them. Probably not, because if they'd known, they would have been moving instead of sitting there like targets at a shooting range. I counted down in my head, estimating the time of flight based on the distance and the gun target line, and right when I got to 0, the world exploded. The first salvo hit exactly where I'd wanted it, right in the middle of the German formation, and the sound of 12 105mm shells impacting simultaneously was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. The ground erupted in a wall of fire and steel and smoke, and I watched through the binoculars as the lead Panzer IV took a direct hit that blew its turret completely off the hull and sent it tumbling through the air like a toy. The other tanks tried to scatter, their engines roaring as they attempted to back up or move laterally, but the second salvo was already inbound because Rodriguez had calculated a spread pattern that would cover their most likely escape routes. More explosions. White phosphorus this time mixed with high explosive, and the entire area where the German formation had been became an inferno of burning metal and screaming men. I kept my eyes on the target area, calling adjustments even though the devastation was already complete, telling Rodriguez to walk the fire 50 meters east, where I could see surviving infantry trying to regroup. Anvil 6 to Hammer Base. Adjust fire, shift 50 meters east, infantry in the open, fire for effect, over. The guns responded immediately and more shells came screaming in, and I watched as German soldiers who'd survived the initial barrage were torn apart by shrapnel and concussion. One of the Panzer IVs was still moving, its track damaged but its gun still operational, and it was trying to bring its 75mm cannon to bear on our lines. I called a single gun adjustment, gave Rodriguez the exact grid coordinate of that tank, and told him to drop 1 round of HE right on top of it. 30 seconds later, that Panzer exploded from a direct hit that must have detonated its ammunition storage, because the whole vehicle came apart in a secondary blast that sent flames shooting 50 feet into the air. The entire fire mission, from my initial call to the final adjustment, lasted maybe 4 minutes, but it felt like hours, and when it was over, and the smoke started to clear, I could see the results of what I'd done. 6 German tanks destroyed or disabled, at least a dozen half-tracks burning, and God only knows how many infantry casualties scattered across the snow in patterns that looked almost artistic from my vantage point. Brennan was saying something next to me, but I couldn't hear him over the ringing in my ears and the sound of my own breathing inside my helmet. Morrison came on the radio, his voice calm and professional, and told me it was good shooting and to keep watching the sector for any follow-up attacks. I acknowledged, but I couldn't take my eyes off the burning vehicles and the bodies I could see through the binoculars, some of them still moving, trying to crawl away from the kill zone I'd created. That's when it hit me, really hit me. What being a forward observer meant in practical terms. I'd just killed maybe 40 men, maybe more, with a radio call and some grid coordinates, and I'd done it from a position of complete safety where none of them could shoot back at me or even see me. They died because I was good at math and map reading, because I'd memorized the right procedures and stayed calm under pressure and remembered to double-check my calculations before I made the call. Morrison later told me that my fire mission had broken up. What intelligence confirmed was the main German armored thrust in our sector, that if those panzers had made it to our lines, they would have punched through and possibly rolled up the entire northern defensive position. He put me in for a Bronze Star, which I received 3 months later at a ceremony I barely remember, but none of that changed the fact that I could still see those German soldiers burning when I closed my eyes at night. The rest of that day was quieter, with only sporadic mortar fire and some half-hearted infantry probes that got chewed up by our machine guns before they could develop into anything serious. The Germans didn't try another armored attack in my sector, and word spread through the defensive positions that the FOs had stopped a major push with artillery fire, which made us simultaneously more respected and more isolated from the regular infantry who didn't quite understand what we did or how we did it. Brennan asked me that evening, as we huddled in our foxhole trying to stay warm, if I felt bad about killing all those Germans. I told him I didn't know yet, that maybe I would feel bad about it later, but right now I was just glad they were dead instead of us. He nodded and didn't ask any more questions, and we sat there in silence, listening to the sound of American artillery firing counter-battery missions against German gun positions somewhere to the west. Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, 3 days after my fire mission, and the siege was officially lifted even though fighting continued in the area for weeks afterward. I stayed with my observation post through Christmas Day, calling fire missions on German positions and watching the front lines shift back and forth in that confused way that battles have, where nobody's really sure who controls what territory at any given moment. Morrison got wounded on the 27th, took shrapnel in the leg from a German mortar round, and had to be evacuated, and I ended up working directly with the Battalion Fire Direction Center for the rest of the Ardennes campaign. They promoted me to platoon sergeant in January and assigned me to train new forward observers, kids fresh from Fort Sill, who had no idea what they were getting into and who looked at me like I was some kind of oracle because I'd survived Normandy and Bastogne. I finished the war in Germany, called fire missions during the Rhine crossing and the push into the Ruhr pocket, and I saw enough death and destruction to last several lifetimes. But nothing ever matched the intensity of those 4 minutes outside Bastogne when I watched 12 howitzers tear apart a German armored formation and knew that every shell that landed was there because I'd put it there. I got out of the army in November 1945, went back to Michigan and tried to pick up where I'd left off before the war. But I couldn't sleep properly for years because every time I closed my eyes, I saw burning panzers and German soldiers trying to crawl away from the kill zone. The VA gave me pills for the nightmares and told me it was combat fatigue and that it would get better with time, and eventually it did get better, but it never completely went away. I'm 79 years old now, living in the same small town where I grew up, and most days I don't think about the war at all. But sometimes, on cold winter mornings, when there's snow on the ground, I'll wake up and remember the weight of that radio handset in my frozen hand and the sound of Rodriguez's voice, asking me to confirm the fire mission. I'll remember checking and rechecking the grid coordinates, terrified that I'd make a mistake, and drop artillery on friendly positions, and I'll remember the satisfaction I felt when the first salvo hit exactly where I wanted it to hit. People thank me for my service when they find out I was at Bastogne, and I always say you're welcome and leave it at that, Because how do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it feels like to be responsible for killing 40 men before they even knew you existed? The truth is that being a forward observer was the most important and the most terrible job I ever had in my life. Important because without us, the artillery was just guessing where to shoot. And terrible because when you do the job right, people die, sometimes a lot of people, and you have to live with that knowledge forever. Morrison told me once, after he came back from the hospital and before we crossed the Rhine, that the mark of a good FO wasn't how many fire missions you called or how many targets you destroyed, but whether you could still look at yourself in the mirror afterward and recognize the person looking back. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but I understand it now, 57 years later, when I catch my reflection and sometimes see the 23-year-old kid who lay in a frozen foxhole outside Bastogne and called down thunder on German armor that never saw it coming. The weird thing is that I'm not sorry I did it, not even a little bit, because those Panzers would have killed a lot of American soldiers if they'd broken through our lines, and protecting my guys was always the mission, regardless of what it cost me personally. But I am sorry about the weight of it, the way it sits on you after all these years, heavy and cold, like the snow that covered everything during the siege. I'm sorry that war forces young men to make decisions that old men spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. And I'm sorry that being good at killing is sometimes the most valuable skill you can have when your country needs you. But most of all, I'm sorry for the German mothers who never saw their sons again because I was better at my job than their sons were at theirs. And I'm sorry that the world works in such a way that sometimes good people have to do terrible things to stop worse things from happening. I never went back to Bastogne, even though I've been invited to reunions and commemorative events over the years. I told my wife once that I couldn't go back because I was afraid I'd find my old observation post and remember too much. Remember the exact sight picture through those Zeiss binoculars when the first shells landed. Remember Brennan's face when he asked me if I felt bad about killing all those Germans. Remember the smell of burning metal and the sound of secondary explosions, and the terrible mathematics of calling artillery fire on human beings. She understood, or at least she said she understood, and she never pushed me to go, and I'm grateful for that because some memories are better left where they are instead of being dragged back into the light and examined. The younger guys at the VFW post sometimes ask me about the war, especially after they've had a few beers, and their own inhibitions have lowered enough to get curious about what combat was really like. I usually tell them sanitized stories, funny anecdotes about training mishaps, or the time our mess sergeant tried to cook Christmas dinner during the siege using whatever supplies he could scrounge. But I never tell them about that fire mission on December 23rd. I never tell them what it felt like to watch through binoculars as men burned to death because I gave someone their grid coordinates, or how I used to wake up at night hearing Rodriguez asking me to confirm the target one more time. Those stories aren't for entertainment or education. They're just weight that you carry, and I see no reason to distribute that weight to people who don't need to carry it themselves. My son asked me once, when he was maybe 16 or 17, if I'd ever killed anyone in the war. I told him yes, but I didn't go into details, and he respected that and didn't ask for specifics. He's in his 40s now with kids of his own, and sometimes I wonder if I should tell him about Bastogne before I die. Leave him with the full truth of what his father did and what it cost. But I can never quite bring myself to do it. What's the point, really? What would he gain from knowing that his dad was responsible for maybe 40 deaths in 4 minutes? It wouldn't make him proud or sad or anything useful. It would just be information, heavy and cold, that he'd have to carry around for the rest of his life without any context for understanding what it meant. The last surviving member of my forward observer team, a guy named Phillips who was with a different OP during the siege, died 3 years ago, and I went to his funeral in Ohio and listened to people talk about what a good man he was and how he'd lived a full life after the war. None of them mentioned that he'd spent December 1944 calling artillery fire on German positions around Bastogne, that he'd been responsible for God knows how many enemy casualties, that he'd carried the same weight I carry, and that we'd sometimes talk about it late at night at reunions when everyone else had gone to bed. At his funeral, I wanted to stand up and tell everyone that Phillips was one of the best forward observers in the 463rd, that his fire missions had saved American lives and helped hold the perimeter when everything looked hopeless. But I didn't, because I knew it wouldn't mean anything to people who hadn't been there and who couldn't understand what we did or why it mattered. I think about Brennan sometimes, wonder what happened to him after Bastogne, whether he made it through the rest of the war or ended up as another name on a casualty report. I lost track of him when I got promoted and moved to a different position, and I never tried to find him afterward because I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He was 19 years old and scared shitless most of the time, but he stayed in that foxhole with me and did his job even when German artillery was landing close enough to throw dirt on us, and that's all you can really ask of someone in combat. If he's still alive, which seems unlikely given how much time has passed, I hope he doesn't remember me as the guy who killed 40 Germans with a radio call. I hope he just remembers me as the forward observer who kept him safe during the siege, even though both things are true and probably can't be separated from each other. The Bronze Star they gave me for that fire mission is in a box somewhere in my attic, along with my other medals and my discharge papers, and all the other physical evidence of those years I spent in uniform. I haven't looked at it in probably 20 years. Don't feel any need to, because medals don't really capture what happened or why it mattered. They're just pieces of metal and ribbon that the army gives you to acknowledge that you did something they considered valuable, but they don't tell you anything about the weight of command or the cost of success or what it's like to be 23 years old and responsible for decisions that end human lives. Morrison deserved a medal more than I did for picking that observation post location and for training me well enough that I didn't panic when the moment came, but he never got one because he was just doing his job as a fire direction officer, and that wasn't considered special enough for recognition. I read somewhere once that the average life expectancy for a forward observer in combat was something like 3 weeks, which made us one of the most dangerous jobs in the army, along with tank crews and combat engineers. I survived 11 months of combat from D-Day to VE Day, which makes me either very good at my job or very lucky or probably both, and I watched a lot of other FOs get killed or wounded during that time. There was something about the job that attracted a certain kind of person, someone who could stay calm under pressure, and who understood that the whole point was to bring accurate fire on the enemy regardless of personal risk, and I was fortunate to work with a lot of guys who fit that description. But I was also fortunate to survive when a lot of them didn't, and I've never quite figured out what that means, or why I deserved to make it home when they didn't. The thing nobody tells you about war, or at least nobody told me, is that the hardest part isn't the fighting or the fear, or even the killing. It's coming home afterward and trying to fit back into a world that kept turning while you were gone. Everyone wants to hear war stories, but they want the sanitized version, the one where Americans are brave and enemies are faceless, and everything makes sense in retrospect. They don't want to hear about calling artillery fire on German teenagers who probably didn't want to be there any more than I did, or about the weight that settles on you when you realize you're good at something that should never be needed in a civilized world. So you smile and say thank you for your service, and you put the weight back in its box where it belongs. And you go on living your life as best you can, while carrying something that most people will never understand and probably shouldn't have to. I called artillery on German armor at Bastogne in December 1944, and the 105mm shells hit before the Panzers even realized they were under attack, and I've been carrying that truth around for 57 years now, like a stone in my pocket. Some days it feels heavier than others, and some days I barely notice it at all, but it's always there. A reminder of what I was capable of when my country needed me to be capable of it. I don't know if that makes me a hero, or just a survivor or something in between, and honestly I stopped worrying about the distinction a long time ago. All I know is that I did what I was trained to do. I kept my people alive, and I paid the price that comes with that kind of responsibility. If there's a lesson in any of this, I suppose it's that war asks impossible things of ordinary people, and sometimes they rise to meet those demands, and sometimes the cost of rising is higher than anyone should have to pay.